Well, we're wondering why 10 o'clock on a Wednesday or Tuesday, excuse me, that you have Family Fest. I mean, it didn't look like there was a great crowd there, but whatever. There were other fish to fry, right? The whole
Yes.
contract negotiation sort of overwhelmed Family Day.
Yeah, I mean, without question, that's a storyline that took over in a dramatic way yesterday. And now the Bears have to figure out how they can get this thing to calm down and hopefully resolve, right? And look, there's 26 days now before we get to the first practice of week 1. So there is time, and it's not like that first practice of week 1 is a hard deadline either. And so Ryan Poles now has to figure out what he needs to do to sort of build that bridge to reconnect with Roquan Smith, because it was very clear from the statement that Roquan put out yesterday that he's willing to lob some grenades into the battlefield and see what happens from there.
Dan, frankly, Ryan Poles hasn't had a lot of good moments publicly as a general manager of the Bears since taking over in January. But I felt like yesterday was his best one. I feel like in terms of response time and real talk and just having to say what he said because of what Roquan did publicly, Ryan Poles did represent the Bears' best interests and his own personal interests as well as I probably reasonably could have expected. Do you agree?
It's a show. Well, it's a show of leadership, David, and you want your general manager to be a strong leader, right? And look, what was he at the dais for? About 4 minutes, right? Only took a handful of questions, but it was enough to put his thoughts out there to kind of give a presence and a sense that he's an authority figure who understands his authority and what he needs to do to try to get this thing resolved. Again, the whole goal is to get this thing to a resolution, and just the ability to understand that this is a major issue, right? It's a center stage issue for this team at this point, and to acknowledge that and to be publicly acknowledging of that, I think is a show of strong leadership. And so in that regard, I applaud Ryan Poles, and I think he also kind of gave you some indications that pushed back on Roquan's thoughts that the Bears don't value him, because I think what he's saying is we very much value him, and we don't have many questions about his fit in our scheme, in our system. We don't have many questions about his future productivity. We are willing to put together a contract that approaches, if not reaches, $100 million in total value. And so now it's a matter of trying to find those other little spots where you can scratch Roquan's belly and check some boxes that make him feel fully valued. But I do think it was a necessary thing by Ryan to kind of have his response to what was obviously a very dramatic statement from Roquan yesterday.
And I understand the idea of a trade demand, but I don't understand if we really believe that is ever going to happen. And the Bears do control his rights. That's something to remember.
No question, Molly. Roquan's contract goes until March, right? And so if they don't have a desire to trade him, if they truly see him as a 25-year-old building block within this defense, then they do control this situation to a certain extent. Now, the statement that Roquan puts out, it increases the fracture, right? And it certainly escalated the tension yesterday, and it makes all of this behind-the-scenes negotiation public. And when you do that, now all of a sudden you've thrown a different punch in the battle, right? And so the question here really comes down to how serious is Roquan about wanting to leave the Bears, which you read parts of his statement, you say, no, he wants to be a Bear for the rest of his career, if possible. So is this mostly a leverage play, right? To very publicly challenge a new regime that hasn't proven anything yet and say, hey, your move, right? Was this Roquan's, coming out of a timeout and saying, look, we're going to go to a full court press here, and we're going to put on the press and see how they respond to it. And now it's up to the Bears to figure out how they will respond to it. I don't get the sense that the divide is so big, emotionally at this point, that they won't be able to reconcile it at some point in the next month or so, just by trying to finagle some numbers and make them work a little bit better.
Dan, Ryan Poles referenced the historic nature of the offer in terms of the size of it. And I think we all look at, Shaq Leonard and Fred Warner. And if that is indeed true in the case, then he's talking about a $100 million contract, roughly, maybe $20 million a year, roughly, for a weak side linebacker. I understand that because I think there's a split over what you think that player is worth and how good Roquan Smith maybe is. How do you feel about the size of that contract, if that is indeed the case, and whether or not, he's better than these guys might be irrelevant as much as the reality is he's next.
Well, it's a whole different conversation, David, because I think that complicates things where there is this sort of dynamic in the league now where just because you're next means you're going to be the highest paid, even though you may not be on that top shelf, right? I think there's a sense in the league that Darius Shaquille Leonard, whatever we're calling him these days, is the best player at that position. That Micah Parsons, right, is a guy who one day is going to reset the market when it's his turn to get paid, that Fred Warner's in that conversation. And then you may drop down a level to where Roquan is, to where Devin White is, to where Levante David and Bobby Wagner and Demario Davis are now. And so, I think the distinction here is between a really good player or an NFL superstar, right? And it sounds like in some ways the Bears are willing to reward Roquan as an NFL superstar, and yet in some ways it's not enough for him just because of the structure of the contract and the way some of the back and forth has been handled. And so it's really interesting because I don't think any of us would sit here and say that without a question, Roquan is a future Hall of Famer, right? And when you're talking about being paid as the highest paid off the ball linebacker in the history of the game in terms of total value of the contract, that should come with some assurance that you're at least going to approach all pro and Hall of Fame level, right? If that's how you want to be paid. And I don't think Roquan's reached there yet. And so now, again, it's how do you get a bridge to make both sides meet somewhere where this can be a tenable relationship going forward?
How much does the fact that the Bears aren't ready to win now affect their willingness or ability to compromise their position? And also factor into that Ryan Poles, his reluctance to want to establish a precedent when you have a player challenging him publicly, basically to stand up for the franchise.
Well, David, the first part of that is it certainly lessens how loud that deadline clock ticks, right? Because you're not expecting to make a run to the Super Bowl this year. And so, say this drags out into September, say Roquan misses a game or two. Does it really set your program back? Not significantly when you're a general manager and you're trying to look at the big picture on how to build a championship roster. I think the conversation of precedent, which you bring up, is a very good one, especially for a new GM. And that goes two ways, right? You want to make sure that you're firm enough as a general manager to show people that you're not going to be pushed around, but you also can't develop a reputation within the league of being hard. And Roquan is not the first one in this offseason to criticize this Bears regime. And then, listen, this includes Matt Feinstein and Cliff Stein, who are instrumental in some of the contract negotiation up there at Hallis Hall. And Roquan used, I think, take it or leave it was in his statement. And that's not the first person that has used that either publicly or privately in regards to the way that this regime has negotiated, either with rookies or with guys they talk to in free agency. And if you start developing a reputation as being a little bit hard to deal with in contract negotiations, well, then when you have $100+ million worth of a cap room and you're trying to make a big push at stars to push you over the top, you might have a little bit more of a challenge. So that's why I say that precedent thing goes two ways in learning how you can be rigid without being so rigid that other people go, man, I don't really want to do business with them.